Before Sparta attained its legendary status, it was a rough, brutal, and as yet unformed entity in the making. Dorian tribes from the north conquered the fertile Eurotas Valley. They brought conquest, but had not yet forged a distinct identity. Early Spartans remained fragmented, a loose federation of warrior farmers living among the conquered populations of Helots and Perioikoi. The city possessed military might, but had not yet found its unique soul. It was during this period of uncertainty that a figure shrouded in myth emerged onto the historical stage, Lycurgus. No other individual in Spartan history cast such a long and enigmatic shadow. Some claim he never existed at all. Other historians suggest he was a prince who renounced his claim to the throne, traveled the known world, meticulously studying the political and social systems of Crete and Ionia, before triumphantly returning with a grand vision for reform. Some sources even assert he consulted the Delphic oracle and received divine guidance. Regardless of the truth, Sparta underwent radical and irreversible changes attributed to his name. Lycurgus didn't merely enact individual laws, he engineered a comprehensive system that transformed every aspect of Spartan life, from birth to death, from farming to the battlefield, from the hearth to the assembly. Property was redistributed, and the use of gold and silver was strictly forbidden. Meals became communal, education was institutionalized brutality, and marriage was declared a civic duty. Even children were considered property of the state. No area of life remained untouched by the reforms. As before, boys entered the agoge at the age of 7, but now the curriculum became even more rigorous and merciless. The aim of the training was not merely to forge warriors, but to cultivate true Spartans. They were deprived of comfort and affection, fed sparingly, just enough to survive, and taught to endure pain stoically, speak concisely, and kill without hesitation. They lived under constant surveillance, encouraged to report their comrades' weaknesses, and severely punished for their own failures. Brotherhood was forged through hardship and brutality, and those who failed to endure simply vanished from the system. In Sparta, girls underwent rigorous training, including running, throwing, and learning war hymns. They were taught to view their bodies not as personal property, but as instruments for the future army. A strong mother was believed to produce strong sons, while a weak woman posed a threat to the state. Marriage rituals often involved a symbolic abduction of the bride. Husbands visited their wives in secret, aiming not for romantic development, but to maintain their martial readiness. Intimacy between spouses was seen primarily as a means of procreation, rather than an expression of love. Pregnancy was revered, and newborn infants were meticulously inspected. Weak or deformed children were rejected, left to die on a hillside. Mercy was not considered a virtue, survival was paramount. The Spartan diet was characterized by simplicity, bordering on asceticism. The famous black broth, made from blood with added vinegar, symbolized not just sustenance, but also a readiness for hardship. There was no place for lavish banquets or excesses in Sparta. Even kings dined alongside ordinary citizens, and any display of excess was met with deep abhorrence. Above all else, the system itself was valued in Sparta. According to tradition, Lycurgus established the Great Retra, Sparta's unwritten constitution, which laid the foundations for a mixed form of government. It provided for 2 kings, a council of elders, 5 ephors, and a popular assembly. This unique balance of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy was maintained less by efficiency and more by a potent combination of fear, honor, and constant surveillance. Sparta transformed into a ruthless machine, precise and relentless. But machines are devoid of feeling. Beneath this rigid exterior lay deeper processes. The Spartan mechanism functioned through the exploitation of human resources, and not just Spartan citizens. For every Spartiate, there were several Helots, enslaved indigenous inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, who tilled the land, produced food, and bore the primary burden of Sparta's economic sustenance. Without the labor of the Helots, the Spartan elite could neither train, nor fight, nor even adequately feed themselves. Yet, the enslaved Helots were far from silent victims. An unquenchable hatred for their oppressors burned in their hearts, manifesting in acts of sabotage, daring escapes, and, at times, open rebellion. The Spartan state was acutely aware of this latent threat. Annually, the powerful Ephors performed a ritual declaration of war against the Helots, not merely a symbolic gesture, but a genuine license for violence. This act allowed any Spartan to kill a Helot with impunity, serving as a potent psychological tool to maintain subservience and to habituate Spartans to brutality. The most terrifying manifestation of this system was the Cryptia. Young Spartans, chosen for their exceptional potential, were selected and dispatched into the countryside, armed only with daggers and devoid of any provisions. Their task was to survive off the land's resources, hiding during the day and hunting at night, eliminating any Helot deemed too audacious, strong, or defiant. Without trial or judgment, the sole purpose of these actions was to maintain constant, unpredictable, and pervasive fear. Such was the terrible price of Spartan order, institutionalized terror, an intrinsic part of their society. While Spartan citizens meticulously polished their shields in preparation for war, the Helots lived in perpetual fear. Sparta was not protected by impregnable walls, nor were its borders guarded by numerous garrisons. Its defense was the entire system itself, a fragile and brutal balance between violence and obedience. However, what Spartans feared most was not external invasion, but internal collapse triggered by a revolt of the enslaved population. In their quest to preserve their uniqueness, Spartans strictly limited contact with the outside world. Foreign travel was discouraged, and foreign traders were regarded with suspicion. Instead of silver and gold, iron coinage was introduced, useless outside Sparta, but perfectly suited for internal circulation. Art served utilitarian purposes, music was martial, and poetry was brief and bloodthirsty. This self-imposed isolation granted Sparta extraordinary strength, but also deprived it of the ability to see and understand what lay beyond its borders. While Athens engaged in lively political debates in its squares, Sparta honed its martial prowess in silent solitude. While Corinth built formidable fleets and forged intricate trade routes, Sparta rejected all forms of luxury. While Ionia delved into philosophical inquiry, Sparta revered physical endurance. And for a time, this ascetic approach bore fruit. In the 6th century BC, Sparta reached the zenith of its power. Its army commanded universal respect, and its rulers, fear. Sparta forged alliances, kept rivals in check, and began forming the Peloponnesian League, a network of dependent city-states sworn to Spartan leadership. Unlike empires built on trade or colonization, Spartan power was rooted in pure, unadulterated fear. However, pride inevitably precedes a fall. The Spartans became convinced of the infallibility of their social order, viewing any change as a sign of decay and innovation as a manifestation of weakness. Their society had no place for artists, inventors, or scholars, only for warriors, mothers of warriors, and the silent class who sustained their existence. But not all were content with such a fate. Within Sparta's austere walls, seeds of discontent began to sprout, not only among the Helots, but also among the Perioikoi, free inhabitants of Laconia, deprived of civic rights, who engaged in trade, building, and crafts, yet never had a voice. They were essential for the functioning of the state, but perpetually remained in the shadows. Even within the ranks of the Spartiates themselves, the first cracks began to appear. The population steadily declined, while the demands remained unbearably rigid. Men who failed to meet military standards were stripped of their status. Wealth, despite the initial redistribution, became concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. And as the number of full citizens dwindled, the burden of responsibility became unbearable for those who remained. Despite everything, Sparta continued along its ingrained path. It continued to train, to march, and to observe. But the world around it was inexorably changing. Greece stood on the cusp of irreversible change. The Persian Wars delivered a powerful shock to the entire Greek world. City-states, previously at odds with one another, unexpectedly united in the face of a common threat from a vast empire stretching from the Aegean shores to the distant lands of India. Sparta, despite initial reluctance, assumed the role of leader in the Greek resistance. It was at the Battle of Thermopylae that it achieved its undying renown. 300 Spartan warriors, led by King Leonidas, valiantly blocked the path of the enormous Persian army in a narrow mountain pass. The outcome of the battle was predetermined, the chances of victory were nil. However, their objective was clear: to delay the Persian advance, give the Greek cities time to unite, and demonstrate to the world what it meant to face death without fear. And they achieved their goal. Leonidas and his warriors fell in battle, but their sacrifice ignited the flame of hope and resistance throughout the Greek world. Following Athens' naval victory and the final defeat of the Persians at Plataea, Persia was forced to retreat, and the legend of Sparta became a symbol of unwavering valor. But glory always brings new expectations and challenges. After the war, Athens emerged as the dominant power, bold, ambitious, and prosperous. They built impregnable walls, created a powerful navy, and forged an empire based on tribute. Athens became a hub of democracy and philosophy. Sparta watched Athens' ascent with a mixture of contempt and apprehension, for Athens embodied everything Sparta was not: openness, free speech, and constant change. Tensions between the two powers mounted, minor skirmishes escalated into more serious conflicts, and eventually, full-scale war erupted. The Peloponnesian War proved protracted and bloody, lasting for decades, marked by sieges, plagues, betrayals, and constantly shifting alliances. Sparta possessed a formidable army, while Athens dominated at sea. The world watched anxiously as two distinct visions of Greece clashed in a deadly struggle. Ultimately, Sparta emerged victorious, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. Triumph came at the cost of Persian gold, Spartan hegemony proved short-lived, and the occupation of Athens bred deep resentment. Sparta's attempts to assert control over the Aegean failed, and having vanquished its rival, Sparta overstretched its resources and buckled under the weight of power, finally fracturing. Internal problems only worsened. The number of Spartiates, citizens who had completed the rigorous egoge and maintained their land allotments, steadily dwindled. Land became concentrated in the hands of a few, nullifying Lycurgus' ideal of warrior equality. The once unbreakable bonds of hoplite brotherhood weakened. Some Spartans grew fabulously wealthy, while others lost their civic rights. The Helots, seizing the moment, rose in rebellion. Entire regions of Messenia declared their independence, necessitating bloody wars to subdue them. Each victory came at an exorbitant cost, and Sparta could no longer replenish its human losses. Attempts at reform repeatedly failed. Kings and ephors became embroiled in disputes, and overseas campaigns ended in disaster. To the north, Thebes rose to prominence, led by the genius of Epaminondas. At Leuctra in 371 BC, the unthinkable occurred: the Spartan phalanx was not merely pushed back, but utterly crushed. The myth of Sparta's invincibility, forged over centuries in the crucible of battle, crumbled to dust. From this moment, an irreversible decline began. After Leuctra, the mask of invincibility was irrevocably shed. The Thebans invaded Laconia, an unheard-of act. They liberated the Messenian Helots and established a new independent state. For the first time in generations, Sparta lost territory, not to Persians or barbarians, but to fellow Greeks. This blow to their pride proved more painful than any strategic loss. The system, founded on immutability, the egoge, the rhetra, collective sacrifice, all served one purpose: survival through unity. But Sparta stood weakened, fragmented, and shorn of its formidable appearance. The decline gathered pace. With the dwindling number of Spartiates, the army steadily shrank. Lacking economic flexibility, the state proved incapable of adapting to new realities. Athens, even in defeat, could boast its poets, thinkers, and traders. Corinth had its merchants, Thebes its generals. Sparta was left with only silence and fading memories of its former glory. In Sparta's history, there were periods of desperate attempts to reform society. King Agis IV, striving for land redistribution and the restoration of egalitarian principles, was executed. Cleomenes III, more radical in his reforms, cancelled citizens' debts, sought to revive the traditional agoge system of education, and bravely fought to restore Sparta's lost greatness. However, despite all his efforts, he too was defeated, facing the might of Macedonian armies and the betrayal of former allies. By the time Rome rose in the west, Sparta had already lost its status as a great power, becoming a historical artifact of sorts. The Romans admired Sparta, studying its laws, quoting its maxims, and extolling its austere way of life. Yet, they felt no fear of Sparta. When the Roman Empire finally absorbed Greece, Sparta was preserved out of nostalgia, rather than any military or political necessity. In subsequent centuries, philosophers and rulers continued to invoke the image of Sparta. Niccolò Machiavelli admired its political stability, Jean-Jacques Rousseau idealized its civic virtues, and Adolf Hitler grotesquely exploited it as an example of racial purity. Revolutionaries saw in Sparta an example of self-sacrifice, fascists lauded its unity, athletes admired its discipline, and monks found inspiration in its asceticism. However, the true Sparta, a brutal, contradictory, and vibrant polis, had long vanished from the face of the earth. Only the myth remained, possessing immense power. Myths exist not because they are entirely true, but because they are useful to society. They offer answers to the eternal questions humanity continues to grapple with: how should children be raised? What do we owe the state? What is more important, freedom or security? Does suffering make us stronger? Is unity possible without oppression? Sparta offered its own answers, which were far from kind or gentle. These were answers forged in fire and steel. In Sparta's prime, we see immense strength arising from a shared purpose. At its zenith, the stark beauty of order and clarity. In its fall, the inherent danger of excessive rigidity and the suppression of free expression. And in its historical memory, a peculiar mirror, reflecting not who we were in the past, but who we might become if we are not careful. Sparta, once a formidable power, had by the dawn of the Christian era become a mere shadow of its former self, a ghost city barely clinging to the edge of historical memory. Roman travelers, passing its crumbling remains, no longer marveled at the grandeur of its temples and palaces, but rather at the fading echo of the discipline that once governed this land. Gladiators, those brutal arena fighters, were likened to Spartans, and philosophers nostalgically extolled their legendary silence. But the fear Sparta once inspired had vanished into oblivion. And yet, the ritual of memory stubbornly persisted. In late antiquity, Spartan youths continued to participate in rites dedicated to Artemis Orthia, in the infamous ceremonies of corporal punishment. They stoically endured lashings before the altar, to the approving cheers of the crowd. Once a harsh test of courage, it had now become a mere spectacle, albeit a brutal one. The physical pain remained, but the profound meaning that had imbued the ritual had irrevocably vanished. With the spread of Christianity, pagan rituals gradually ceased. Ancient sanctuaries were abandoned and forgotten. The agoge, the Spartan system of education, faded into the past. The rhetra, the famous Spartan maxims, were forgotten. The names of kings vanished from people's memories. Only the empty shell of a once great Sparta remained. Yet, remarkably, this shell managed to outlast far more powerful civilizations. In the Middle Ages, monks painstakingly recorded tales of Spartan virtue. During the Renaissance, humanists eagerly debated the Spartan constitution, finding in it a model to emulate. In the Enlightenment, revolutionaries devoured Plutarch, finding inspiration in his works. They all saw in Sparta an ideal of purity, a state free from corruption, utterly focused on achieving its goals, and absolutely fearless. However, they saw in Sparta only what they wished to see. The real Sparta, with its forced marriages, slave labor, and institutionalized violence, was too brutal and unpalatable for unqualified praise. Thus, the myth of Sparta underwent careful refinement, softening, and reinterpretation. Leonidas transformed into a symbol of self-sacrifice, Lycurgus into a wise philosopher king, and Spartan women into icons of unyielding pride. The Helots, the disenfranchised slaves, were conveniently forgotten. The pervasive fear that permeated Spartan society was downplayed. And the profound silence characteristic of Spartans was mistakenly interpreted as a sign of deep wisdom. Even today, the echo of the past resonates. The word Spartan adorns gymnasium walls, inspires military mottos, and serves as a theme for speeches, symbolizing strength, conciseness, and determination. However, in reflecting on Sparta's greatness, we often overlook the colossal price paid for these qualities, countless lives sacrificed to maintain simplicity, and suppressed voices silenced in the name of preserving focus. History offers us a rich palette of models to emulate. Some inspire with their triumph and prosperity, others, like Sparta, with their extreme asceticism, serve as a stark warning. The resilience of Sparta's legacy, etched not in stone but in humanity's collective memory, testifies that ideas can outlive empires. But this very resilience reminds us that the past cannot always serve as a reliable guide. At times, it appears before us as a chilling warning, engraved on bronze shields. For Sparta was not merely a city-state, it was a question to which we are still seeking an answer.